Edwin Canestracci here, and yes, I'm here to discuss Jefferson Airplane. This is a band I've never ever talked about, and they happen to be one of my favorite bands. Enjoying a little Hennessy, as I'm known to do from time to time. Think about Jefferson Airplane. You know, everyone knows the name Jefferson Airplane. They know a couple of the big hits. They know like Somebody to Love and White Rabbit. I feel like that's pretty much what most people know about. They know a couple of the hits. They know that they're this 60s band. They're very locked in there with a certain time period and the San Francisco Haight-Ashbury scene. You've seen the documentaries before. You've seen the montages. You've seen clips of hippies dancing to Somebody to Love. And I think to a degree, actually to a large degree, I feel like they've been very marginalized. And history's been somewhat reductive to Jefferson Airplane. I feel that they are a far more significant band that they are given credit for, and definitely a superior band than they're given credit for. They're definitely an album-oriented band, great albums. In fact, I think they have a spotless discography if we're talking about the first legitimate run of Jefferson Airplane, which is this period I am discussing from 1966 to 1973. There's 4 albums in particular. There's a 4-album run that I think is one of the great 4-album runs, and they're all masterpieces in my opinion. Yes, 4 masterpieces, and everything else is great. And a couple very interesting side projects that I'm going to discuss as well. When I was a teenager, they did have a stronger reputation, I feel, then. And I got into Jefferson Airplane. I had a greatest hits. I don't know if best of or greatest hits. I had that on CD back when I was like in junior high and first getting into music in a very deep way. It was shortly after The Doors. The Doors were a very major group with me, and Jim Morrison as a hero and icon. That kind of set me down the rabbit hole. And of course, it wasn't long before I was struck by Grace Slick. I saw some clips of her. I think it was on VH1 Classics of her doing White Rabbit. What an amazing song that was. And like that was like totally what I was getting into at that point with The Doors. And at that point, Jefferson Airplane definitely spoke to me. But I just got the greatest hits and I loved every song on it. It was a very strong greatest hits. It was one of those greatest hits that was almost a little too strong. It's like I listened to it and I thought, well, this is it. I don't need anything else. The greatest hits was like such a complete experience that I didn't feel I needed to go elsewhere. And man, was I wrong to do that, because their albums, I was missing out a lot of great stuff. I mean, they only had like 2 songs from Crown of Creation. How messed up is that? I definitely needed to do the deep dive. I did that a little bit later on in my 20s. Suddenly the internet was in the game, and I had a period where I just kind of did a deep dive into Jefferson Airplane. Admittedly, some of it was my infatuation with Grace Slick. I would watch a lot of old videos with her on the Dick Cavett show and stuff like that. And I was very taken and intrigued by her. And that led me into diving even more into their music. And then when I actually got their original albums, there was like a wave of remasters and I got all their albums. That's when I discovered how great their albums were and how I was missing out on all these great deep tracks. And at that point, Jefferson Airplane became one of my favorite bands. And I still listen to them. I've been on a kick, so I thought, hey, this would be a great opportunity for me to talk about these albums, many of which I think are unsung and not enough people talk about in the classic rock lexicon. I feel that these albums should be talked about just as much as the Beatles or the Stones or Dylan albums or Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, all those great bands. I feel that Jefferson Airplane should be in that conversation. Yes, I think they should be in that conversation. So 66, 73, hey, let's do this. Let's have fun. It's going to be loose and crazy like those hippies in San Francisco in the 60s. First album, really, really good. It's called Jefferson Airplane Takes Off. That's a great title because that's literally what's happening here. It's their first album. They're taking off. And yeah, they're leaning into the airplane thing. This is a strong debut. I don't think it's as strong as all the albums they would do subsequently because there is something missing. There is one person, a very important person that's missing from this early lineup. Yes, Grace Slick is not in the band. A folk singer named Signe Tolly Anderson she's decent enough. She's a decent enough folk singer. But sorry, Signe, she doesn't have the power or the uniqueness that Grace Slick would have. And it's clear she's not a star. Like, there's not a star in the band. That's the thing. It's very similar to what Stevie Nicks would do like 10 years later in Fleetwood Mac, when suddenly they had a star and she helped take them to the next level. And of course, Stevie Nicks was very influenced by Grace Slick, like lots of people. But we'll talk more about that when we talk about Grace's first appearance on the next album. And we also don't have Spencer Dryden, who would become the drummer most associated with Jefferson Airplane, who played on all of their classic albums. Actually, the drummer on this album is Skip Spence, who people might know from Moby Grape and a really great solo album he did before he became kind of like Syd Barrett, this acid-drenched casualty of the drug culture of the late 60s. But yeah, he was playing drums. He plays drums on this and on a couple tracks on the next album, actually. You do have the core group of musicians here who make up Jefferson Airplane, and that's Marty Balin, who I guess a lot of people think of him as like the secondary lead vocalist after Grace, although they weren't the only two that sang. Marty probably sang the most recognizable songs after Grace, and he had a very distinct and really great voice. I'm a big fan of Marty Balin. He was also a very talented songwriter. You also have Paul Kantner, who I was always very amused by whenever watching interviews of him back in the 90s, whenever you watch Jefferson Airplane, like behind the music stuff. And he's really, when you get down to it, he's the heart of the band. He's one of the main songwriters of the band. And I think he also was kind of like their spiritual leader in a sense. He was the one that really had the ethos, both the political and sociological ethos of the band. And I think he was the driving force. Not to take away from Marty and the others, but I think Paul Kantner is the heart of Jefferson Airplane, and eventually it would be a king and queen that would rule Jefferson Airplane, and that would be Paul Kantner and Grace Slick. But this stage, pretty much like Paul and Marty, they were the main guys. But you also have Jorma Kaukonen. He's an amazing guitarist. Musically, he's a very important part of the band. He would also emerge as a songwriter on later albums as well. He was a blues guitarist, very similar to Eric Clapton, where he was a traditionalist, but he got enticed and seduced by the psychedelic rock world, and kind of like Eric Clapton did with Cream, Kaukonen did with Jefferson Airplane. I will say this, and this is not a hot take. I think this is a legit take. I'm a fan of Eric Clapton, so I'm not like trashing Eric Clapton, but I think Jorma Kaukonen is a stronger guitarist than Eric Clapton, and I think a more innovative guitarist. In fact, the only two guitarists in the late 60s that I would put above Kaukonen are Jimi Hendrix and Jeff Beck. That's it. They're the only two guitarists that I think are even more innovative. But man, if you listen to what he's doing in Jefferson Airplane, hey, starting with this album in 1966, I mean, this is a year before Jimi Hendrix's first album. The only person who's like one step ahead of him is Jeff Beck, in my opinion. He's doing some very, very innovative guitar playing, and it would only get more innovative as the albums progressed. A very, very talented and important guitarist who really helped shape the sound of not just psychedelic rock, but prog rock, hard rock, heavy metal. I think all these different subgenres of rock, Kaukonen helped to develop and helped create the language of guitar playing. And I don't think he's discussed nearly enough, like the band in general. Oh, and now let's talk about Jack Cassidy, the bass player, since the first album and Jefferson Airplane's bassist on all their albums. Jack Cassidy, big fan, very big fan, and another very undervalued musician, in my opinion. In fact, the only bassist that gives this guy a run for his money in the late 60s is Paul McCartney. Yeah, that's it. It's pretty much Paul McCartney and Jack Cassidy. No one else can touch Jack Cassidy, not in rock music anyway. Maybe you'd go into like jazz or funk and R&B. But in terms of rock music, in terms of a white rock basis, it's Paul McCartney and Jack Cassidy. Jack Cassidy, like McCartney, he really works a fretboard. He does great fuzz bass, distorted fuzz bass, really fat bass lines. And he's very prominent. I would say this guy foreshadows, like a lot of things in Jefferson Airplane, foreshadows a lot of post-punk and new wave, in my opinion, where the bass was very prominent and drives a lot of music. While the guitars are kind of circling around the core rhythm, it's that bass is the musical heart of the band that's kind of pushing things forward a lot of times, like with the song White Rabbit. Stellar musician, like the whole goddamn band. And this is a solid album. I would describe it as somewhere between the Byrds and the Yardbirds. It's like, it's folkier than the Yardbirds, but bluesier than the Byrds. And if you can picture something that's kind of straddling that line, with maybe a little splash of Revolver era Beatles, and you will get a sense of what this album is and the vibe of this album. And it's great. I love it. My favorite track would be the opening track, Blues from an Airplane, Marty Balin track. It is really moody and soulful. Marty Balin essentially is like a blue-eyed soul singer as far as I'm concerned, almost kind of like a white hippie Sam Cooke. He has a very smooth voice, and it's a beautiful voice. And his vocals really helped elevate the band. Even though there are four primary singers, Jorma Kaukonen would also sing, and he would emerge more on later albums. But primarily, the main vocal harmonies are usually a trio of vocals, but they don't have the female voice yet that they really need, that's really going to mesh perfectly with Marty and Paul Kantner. And hell, let's just get to it, all right? Because this is a great album, but they totally took it to the next level with the classic from 1967. Here we go, The Summer of Love, Surrealistic Pillow. Yes, this is the album where Grace Slick makes her debut. It's also where drummer Spencer Dryden makes his debut with the band. So this is essentially the beginning of the classic lineup, the classic Jefferson Airplane lineup. And this is the beginning of the 4-album run. The 4-album run where all 4 albums are masterpieces, and this is actually my least favorite of the 4 masterpieces, but still, it's an essential album, an essential 1967 album. One of the first albums to come out in 1967. It was an early release, came out in February, so it's pretty much this album and the Doors' debut. They're really the albums that really kickstarted the Summer of Love, even though it wasn't summer yet, it was winter, but this was before Sgt. Pepper, before Are You Experienced. These 2 albums, the Doors' debut and Surrealistic Pillow, is really where we have this major cultural shift. And I don't think this album, I mean, it gets recognized. This is, I would say, their most acclaimed album. It's recognized to a degree, but I don't think it gets brought up enough. It doesn't get brought up enough as much as the Doors' debut, or Are You Experienced, or Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This, again, should be part of that conversation. Grace Slick, she really added that element that they needed. She's a star. You hear it in her voice immediately. She brought hits with her, too. She was in the band. She was the singer for a San Francisco band called The Great Society, and Somebody to Love was actually written by the guitarist in that band. She took that song that the guitarist in that band wrote and gave them a hit. However, the other song, White Rabbit, that's all Grace Slick. Grace Slick wrote that song. And this is where I want to talk a bit about Grace Slick. I'm going to gush about Grace Slick a little bit now. Grace Slick, I think, is very underrated on a lot of levels. Like, yes, she has a name. People know her. She gets recognized as like one of the first female rock stars. I would argue she is the first female rock star. I mean, ultimately, Janis Joplin's a blues and soul singer. No disrespect to her, but it was just kind of about her singing and her attitude. She was kind of like the Amy Winehouse of her day. Whereas Grace Slick is this amazing songwriter, this personality, this voice, and really something new. Like, she wasn't singing in a traditionally bluesy or blue-eyed soul way, the way that singers, especially female singers, would sing, or they would sing with a lot of earnestness or a kind of country twang. Like, there was none of that rootsy stuff in the way that Grace sang. Grace sang in this very controlled, measured way, and even when she did her trademark vibrato, she kind of utilized it the same way like a heavy metal singer kicks in with the banshee vocals. Like, she throws it in when she wants to kind of essentially crank things up to 11. You know, that's when she throws out the vibrato, but she doesn't like sing that way perpetually. She's an amazing singer, and I think she was a big influence, not just on female singers. Of course, you would hear like influence on Stevie Nicks and Susie Sue and a lot of female singers. But I also think like someone like Rob Halford. I hear a lot of Grace Slick, especially in the earlier Priest albums, and also in terms of her persona. Like, she's the one before Rob Halford, before Freddie Mercury, before Elton John. Grace Slick was like the one that kind of brought that regal pageantry to the proceedings. Before David Bowie. I think that she brings this aristocratic quality that you didn't really have in rock singers before. In my opinion, there's no question she is the first bona fide female rock star, and she was a peer and contemporary of Jim Morrison. She is the female half of what Morrison was doing in 1967. Another thing is Grace Slick is a very underrated songwriter. I think a lot of people just think that she's just this beautiful woman with a cool voice. They don't realize that like Stevie Nicks after her, that she's a great songwriter, and she also plays most of the piano throughout Jefferson Airplane. Whenever you hear piano, with a few exceptions, it's usually her. She was a very good piano player, and she wrote White Rabbit by herself. That's like I Am the Walrus level. In the same way, she's like the female half of Jim Morrison. From a songwriting standpoint, I feel like White Rabbit is the female half of I Am the Walrus. That was John Lennon's Lewis Carroll tribute, and here was Grace Slick's. But Grace Slick's is actually first. Yes, White Rabbit came out half a year before I Am the Walrus came out. This idea that Lewis Carroll and Alice in the Wonderland, the Alice books, are associated as a heady thing, as a psychedelic thing, this idea gets generated via White Rabbit. So it's Grace Slick that really helps change culture and brings that idea. Like now, you can't think of Alice in Wonderland without thinking of LSD and hippies. And Grace Slick, she was the first one to make that connection, even before John Lennon. So I don't think she's given definitely not enough credit. And on subsequent albums, she's writing a lot of great songs. And she added that third harmony that we really needed. Now with Marty and Paul Kantner's voices, it's a whole. The same way that the Beatles or the Beach Boys are a whole when you hear how all their voices fit perfectly. Far stronger than Signe Anderson. Grace's voice, even when it's a backing vocal, it's commanding. It pushes that chorus ahead. Makes everything sound anthemic. Wait, so about this album. Album's great. My only issue with Surrealistic Pillow is I think the track listing is a little wonky. 3/5 of a mile in 10 seconds should be the opening track. I remember that Greatest Hits I had, it opened with that. And this opens with She Has Funny Cars, which is a really great song, but I just don't think it's the strongest opening. Also, I think White Rabbit, it's kind of weird. It's like the second to last track. That should be the needle drop for the second side. Then you would put the needle on and you would just hear the bass. Boom, 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 boom. But yeah, I never get burned out from White Rabbit. It's one of the great songs. Somebody loves. Catchy tune. They wrote better songs, in my opinion, but it's a really catchy song. Today, my favorite song on the album. This is a beautiful song written by Marty Balin and Paul Kantner. Definitely one of their best known songs. Marty sings it so beautifully. One of his best vocal performances. This is a song I never get tired of. Marty has a great rocker at the end. Plastic Fantastic Lover. It's a great album. It's amazing that they did even better in just a couple months later. Yes, this is back in the day when bands knocked out albums, sometimes 2 masterpieces in 1 year. Not so uncommon back then. But yes, in the fall of 1967, Jefferson Airplane released another album with this classic lineup. After Bathing at Baxter's, easily my second favorite Jefferson Airplane album. It's full-fledged psychedelic. They kind of shake off all the mid-60s folk rock thing that they were doing with the first 2 albums. And now they go head first into psychedelic, epic, proto-prog rock splendor. Yeah, that's another thing. Why is Jefferson Airplane just called psychedelic rock? Their trajectory, their evolution as artists is very similar to Pink Floyd. They're moving and progressing, I think, even faster and getting to what Pink Floyd wouldn't really get to until the early 70s. They're getting to sooner. And yet, we don't really talk about Jefferson Airplane as a prog rock band, as a progressive rock band. But it's all here, all the elements. Rock music that's a hybrid of jazz and classical and all these different elements, experimental, long sequences of different changing parts and complex, sophisticated musicianship. It's all there. The title of the album is a reference to doing LSD. Baxter was their code for LSD. So yes, this is a big druggy album. It's all about doing LSD. The Ballad of You, Me, and Poonail. Love that song. Now from this point on, they don't have any sequencing problems. I love how this album is sequenced, just like all the subsequent albums. This is a great opening track. It's a great anthem. The harmony's amazing. I want to talk just a little bit about Paul Kantner's voice now. Yes, he's not a standout like Marty and Grace, but he is kind of the rock of these 3-part harmonies. He does this lower croon, kind of icy cold, a little proto-Bowie-esque, a little proto-new wave. Again, just like I said about Grace Slick, I think it's very innovative. Like, he's not singing in a traditionally folky or bluesy way. He's singing in this new aristocratic kind of way. He doesn't have the emotional resonance of Marty Balin, and he doesn't have the power of Grace Slick, but his voice grounds the band. Just like I said, spiritually, politically, musically, as a songwriter, I feel Paul Kantner is the heart of the band. This is their best album in terms of harmonies, in my opinion. The harmonies are amazing. Young Girl Sunday Blues, really catchy song. Martha, written by Paul Kantner. Amazing song, amazing song. Kind of folky, but kind of medieval. It's a beautiful song. Wild Time. Woo, that's like a top 5 Jefferson Airplane song for me. Kantner wrote it again. I think there's 2 songs in particular on this album that really capture what I think the Summer of Love might have felt like. And this is one of them. Hedonistic rock music, and like a new kind of rock music. This is the revolution. This is the culture changing in real time. Music that's made with passion and vibrancy, then that passion and vibrancy comes through, and it still exists. It still exists now. Jefferson Airplane is forever young, making Wild Time, and it can connect to us at any time. Rejoice, great song that Grace Slick wrote. You get to hear her amazing piano playing on it. Very talented woman, this Grace Slick. Two Heads, another great Grace Slick song. Kind of a sequel to White Rabbit in a way. Very dark and Corellian. Love it. And then we got the masterpiece. I think the greatest Jefferson Airplane song ever. Won't You Try / Saturday Afternoon, and I prefer a / to parentheses. This is like Wild Time taken to the next level. It's like even deeper. It's even more euphoric. It's a spiritual song, but not in a hackney way, in a very earthy way. It's very earthy, and I guess you could say hedonistic, but beautifully hedonistic. Returning to the land, the children, God's children, embracing everything that's beautiful in the world. Sex and art and poetry and music and the ocean and the sun. Everything that could happen that you could discover on a Saturday afternoon, maybe with a little help from LSD. But regardless of drugs or no drugs, there is something undeniably beautiful about this music. And if you want to really have your mind blown, just like this thumbnail said you would, check out the Woodstock video of 1969. Check out them doing this song at Woodstock in 1969. The best performance, yes, in my opinion, the best performance at Woodstock is Jefferson Airplane doing Won't You Try / Saturday Afternoon. It is amazing in the way that they're singing. And this is live. It's not lip synced. It's not AI. 3 fucking human beings up there, their voices merging, and it's a thing of fucking beauty. Watch that. In fact, I will leave a link down below. Anyway, so this album is a masterpiece, and the only thing that's better than this in the Jefferson Airplane discography is the next album, Crown of Creation. My favorite Jefferson Airplane album from 1968. This is just one of my favorite albums, period. We still got the classic lineup, and there's a professionalism to it. I will say that the 3 best albums, in my opinion, are all produced by a guy named Al Schmidt. He produced Baxter's, he did this one, and he did the next one, Volunteers. I do think he helped embellish Jefferson Airplane sound with some studio expertise and polish, but not at expense of the band's experimentation. You know, they're never reined in, similar to like George Martin with the Beatles. This album opens interestingly with an acoustic song, but a kind of druggy psychedelic acoustic song, which I love. One of my favorite Jefferson Airplane songs, written by Grace Slick again. What do you know? What a great songwriter. Lather, amazing song she wrote about drummer Spencer Dryden, who she was dating at the time. He was her boyfriend at the time, and he had turned 30, so she kind of wrote this song as a little bit of a joke about how, oh, now you're 30, so you're like old. But it hits upon some deeper ideas, this idea of saying goodbye to your youth and making a parallel with all those young men in Vietnam at the time who were also giving up their youth. And it's a beautiful song. It's a haunting song. To me, this is a level of artistry where lyrics lyric, music, and production reaches, to me, like this is like Beatles level mastery. I love all the weird sound effects that they make and very organic and warm. This is like a very earthy, subtle psychedelia and an evolution from the last album. In Time, great Paul Kantner song. He's becoming a stronger singer now, still in that kind of monotone, icy way of his, but it's a stronger, icy monotone voice, and I love that song. Goes into Triad, one of my all-time favorite songs. This is like a top 5 Jefferson Airplane song for me. Written by David Crosby. Now, David Crosby originally wrote this for the Byrds. There is a version that came out many years later, the Byrds version, as a bonus track. And I love it. It's great. I've also listened to demos that David Crosby did. I love all that stuff. I'm a huge David Crosby fan, by the way. And his first solo album is one of my favorite albums of all time. And one day I will do a video about it. That being said, this to me is the definitive version of Triad. It's the best version of Triad. Between the music, the playing, the acoustic guitar playing, the production, and Grace's voice. Wow. One of her best vocal performances. And I think having a woman singing the song, which is essentially about a threesome, David Crosby wrote it as a way to kind of convince his 2 girlfriends that it was all right that he was sleeping with both of them. It was like, hey, I love both of you. Why can't we just, why can't we just love each other? Hey, can't we just love each other, man? Essentially, it's a guy trying to get his end in, and he's trying to make it sound all romantic. But when Grace sings it, because she's a woman, it just adds a different element to it. It's more subversive, especially then. It was a very subversive idea that it'd be a woman with 2 men. And I feel it's more sensual and more provocative with Grace singing it. But credit to David Crosby. It's an amazing song. But this is definitely the definitive Triad and one of my all-time favorite tracks. Marty Balin wrote another classic, Share a Little Joke. Love Share a Little Joke. A very moody but catchy song. God, this is a top-notch band. They're just knocking out so many great songs. Crown of Creation, the title track. Another thing is, I don't think Jefferson Airplane gets brought up enough in the proto-metal discussion. Yeah, listen to Crown of Creation and The House at Punale Corners. Those songs are like so dark and heavy. They're like proto-doom metal in my opinion. And this is 2 years before Black Sabbath's first album. From a sonic standpoint, there is a heaviness, and from a tonal standpoint, there is a heaviness that definitely foreshadows heavy metal in my opinion, and definitely foreshadows stuff that Sabbath and Judas Priest and other metal bands would do later. Greasy Heart, another great Grace Slick song, and hey, she's knocking out a lot of catchy songs. What do you know? God, what a great song is Greasy Heart. Great satirical lyrics, a lot of sense of humor in her lyrics, and Greasy Heart's a great example of that. Kokkonen does some amazing wah-wah guitar work on it. God damn, I love this band. This is an amazing album. If you want to watch some great performances, watch them on the Smothers Brothers. Grace did something that would be considered very politically incorrect and controversial by today's standards. Hell, I think it probably was back then in 1968 too. They were pushing boundaries, Jefferson Airplane. This is a very important album. To me, it's up there with Beggar's Banquet and the White Album. This is a classic 68 revolutionary rock album. Recognize. Now we get to the 4th masterpiece in the row. Yes, this is the 4th and final album of the run I was talking about. And this album is from 1969. Volunteers. Now, I do put Crown of Creation and After Bathing at Baxter's ahead of this album, but this is still a really, really, really strong album. It's a masterpiece after all. And I would say this is my 3rd favorite Jefferson Airplane album. Opens with another great anthem, kind of like You, Me, and Punale, but militant. This is like the militant album. We Can Be Together is a great militant anthem. Beautiful, soaring harmonies. Rage Against the Machine wishes they could sound like this. Great piano work from Nicky Hopkins, who some people might know from doing some amazing piano session work with the Rolling Stones. He does some great work on this song and also Wooden Ships, which I will discuss later. God, those vocals, those powerful harmonies, and We Can Be Together, it charges you up, man. It charges you up. And you know what I love about it is it's militant, but it's like down and dirty. Like they're embracing not just their righteousness, but also their hedonism. There's always this balance with Jefferson Airplane. They like their earthy delights, and they like throwing it in the face of the squares. This is also one of the first mainstream songs to have the word motherfucker. Yeah, Grace Slick sings Up Against the Wall, motherfucker. And she sings it. She sings the motherfucker, which makes it even more badass in a way. And it's a great way to open this album. Good Shepherd starts showing Jorma Kaukonen's rootsy side that's going to be emerging more. This is the side you would hear more in his side project, Hot Tuna, where it was a little Dylan-esque, a little bluesy, a little country, and it added a nice offset. It added another color, another nuance to Jefferson Airplane is this countryside. You also hear it again with The Farm. Farm is a hippie farm song. They're gonna all get together and milk cows and shit. They probably didn't really do that. I can't picture Grace Slick milking a cow, but I can picture her sending some guy to do it for her, and then she wakes up 3 in the afternoon, and she has herself some very fresh milk that some farmhand provided for her. Hey, Frederick. This is why Grace Slick deserves to sleep until 3 p.m. Because she writes songs like Hey, Frederick. An amazing song. My favorite song on the album. God damn, it's just a powerful song. And by the way, Nicky Hopkins plays on a couple key tracks, but most of the piano, like the piano on this song, like the piano on all the Grace Slick written songs, is courtesy of Miss Slick herself. Great dark, caustic lyrics about a love affair gone wrong, I think. Then it goes into this whole jazzy progressive section, and Grace is playing the piano and is improvising along with the guys playing guitar. This is jazz level expertise. It's exciting, adventurous music. It's a 9-minute long track. Never gets boring. Wooden Ships, another David Crosby written song. Kantner and Stephen Stills also made contributions. Came out the same year as the Crosby, Stills, and Nash version. Now, in this case, I would actually go with the Crosby, Stills, Nash version. I think that's the best version of Wooden Ships. Something about that version, it's just a little more intimate, it's a little earthier, and it just connects with me a little bit more. But just a little bit more. I mean, I love this. This version of Wooden Ships is amazing. It's majestic. It's cinematic. It's a musical journey. It evokes so many strong feelings. I mean, I love that both these Wooden Ships exist. I love both of them. I like to listen to them back to back sometimes, like Wooden Ships Part 1, Part 2. Sorry about that. Things can get a little crazy here in Poonail Corners. Yeah. I never told anyone this, but my condo is located in Poonail Corners. Yeah. Back to looking at the ocean and the new land and Wooden Ships. Amazing. God, this is on level of anything Pink Floyd would ever do. It's that level of artistry. Eskimo Blue Day, another great Slick song, one she co-wrote with Kantner. Great lyrics. I love that whole doesn't mean shit to a tree. Doesn't mean shit to a tree. Get over yourself, human beings. Another great jazzy prog rock song. God damn. Amazing stuff. It ends with another awesome anthem. I would say the best known song on this album. Volunteers. And it's co-written by Marty Balin. So there you go. You think he's Mr. Square? Well, he co-wrote the ultimate counterculture revolutionary rock song. Yeah, he wrote it along with Kantner. Volunteers. And Marty's vocals are amazing on it. He really sings it too. He's got all this earnest, blue-eyed soul energy that he brings to it. He's really bringing it like a soul singer. I love Volunteers. We're going to change the world. Or we're going to do a lot of cocaine and break up and then sell out and become a bland stadium act. But but that didn't happen yet. They're fighting the power now. 1969. They're doing it, man. They're doing it. They go to Woodstock, Altamont. Marty gets fucking beat up by a bunch of Hell's Angels. This guy, the things he would do for rock and roll. Would you do that for rock and roll? Would you take a hit from a Hell's Angel? No, I didn't think so. Well, Marty Balin did. And he's the guy they call the Square in the band. Whoa. How hip are the other people? Apparently, Spencer Dryden was too hip. Yeah, too hip for Jefferson Airplane. He had to go. The fact that he broke up with Grace Slick didn't help. But not only did they shit can the drummer, Marty Balin left. Yeah, he left on a high note with Volunteers, but maybe after getting beat up by a Hell's Angel and the band doing drugs all the time, they were doing a lot of cocaine. That's what Marty Balin said. He said, they were doing a lot of cocaine and making cocaine music, and he wasn't into it. Well, with all due respect, Marty Balin, Zeppelin, I like cocaine music. So I'm all for it. Now, yes, I will say moving forward, now that we're going to discuss the last two studio albums from Jefferson Airplane, yes, I do not consider these albums resounding masterpieces like the last four. However, I still think they're great albums. I love these two albums that I'm about to discuss, and I think there's a very interesting era of the band that is very overlooked. Yes, I would start with the four albums I just discussed, but I actually put these albums ahead of the very first one. They're strong albums. Bark, which we're going to talk about now. Yes, Bark. Now they're producing themselves, and essentially this Jefferson Airplane just doing whatever the fuck their druggy hearts want to do. The original cover, it was very cool. The vinyl record, it came in a shopping bag. It was like a shopping bag cover, and then when you remove the bag, oh, there you go. Look, you see, there was like a fish. Yeah, that's cool. This is very innovative. This and the next album cover, they were really pushing the envelope, just like Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd would do in the 70s, in terms of album packaging and album art. Very cool stuff. Very innovative and fun. I like the pop art aesthetic. And also they brought in a violinist. Yes, a violinist, Papa John Creech, who would also go on and be part of Jefferson Starship. This is an album, it's a grower. I didn't love it at first. I always thought the first side was strong. I think the first side, if you like the other Jefferson Airplane albums, there's no reason why you wouldn't like the first side of this album. It's the second side, especially after the track Lawman. After that, it kind of goes in a, well, we'll talk about that. But the first half, man, when the earth moves again, another rousing anthem. Beautiful song, Soaring, written by Paul Kantner, and it's a spiritual song, very spiritual to me. It's one of the most beautiful songs ever written. And the harmonies, God, I mean, even without Marty Balin, that's the thing. No disrespect to Marty Balin. Yeah, he helped him with some schmaltzy love songs in the 70s when they sold out. But at this point, they were making revolutionary space rock and roll. They didn't need him. Sorry, Marty. You did some great stuff. But Grace and Paul Kantner were doing some pretty cool stuff on their own. You also have Jorma Kaukonen really emerging as a songwriter here. Feels so good. Great song. Great bluesy, rockin' kind of song. And I really like how Kaukonen sings this one. He has almost a little bit of a serpentine Iggy Pop quality. Just has this real sexy, swaggering thing going. And I love it. Great guitar work. Then we have Crazy Miranda, another great Grace Slick song. Really catchy, very powerful song. Love her singing. Some of her best vocals ever. Pretty As You Feel. This is a nice collaboration from the whole band and a very kind of smooth, kind of jazzy song. Really like that a lot. Even the instrumental's not bad, and I don't normally like rock instrumentals, but Wild Turkey is a pretty good one. Then you got another stellar Grace Slick song that opens side 2, Lawman, a powerful song, very rockin', very caustic. Rock and Roll Island. Yeah, it's a little silly sounding, but it's fun. Rock and Roll Island's a fun place to be, and as you would suspect from the title, it's rockin'. Third Week in the Chelsea. Great song from Kaukonen, which definitely sounds like Hot Tuna. It pretty much sounds like a Hot Tuna song on a Jefferson Airplane album. But hey, it gives a nice little variety. You know, overall, this album, even though it's not a double album, it has a double album vibe. That's all I can say. Maybe it's because of the eclecticism. Maybe because it goes into some quirky areas with the next couple tracks. But it's like a double album that's not a double album. Think of it that way, and I think you'll enjoy it more. Grace Slick has this really gonzo weird song in which she sings in German called Never Argue with a German If You're Tired, or European song. I guess we'll say European song because that's much easier to say. Really cool song. This song was a little tricky for me, but eventually I got into it. Like this, and especially that next track, Funk. Kind of experimental, quirky, a little bit of a toss off, but not bad. I've grown to really like the eccentric second side. I think this is a really cool album. And it's a time when people weren't just making music to have hits. They were making album experiences. And much like with the White Album, it's the little quirky moments that are part of the whole greater tapestry of it that makes it a real album. You know, you have to have these little dissonant notes that add to the whole picture. And it ends in a very big way with a great epic track called War Movie, Paul Kantner's War Movie. Very cinematic, very powerful. Great way to end this album. This is a great album. I love Bark. And if you're hip, you'll love it too. And then we got Long John Silver from 1972. Now this one had even cooler album packaging. It was a cigar box. Essentially the album was in a big cigar box. This was like a stoner thing because a lot of stoners would put their marijuana in cigar boxes. So this was a reference to that. And the inner sleeve, it was a picture of cigars. This is one of the great packages. This is up there with the stuff Led Zeppelin was doing. And to me, it's all part of their expression. This album is even stronger than Bark. I love this album. This is definitely my fifth favorite Jefferson Airplane album. It is definitely their most hard rockin' album. I don't know why this album didn't do better. It's really catchy, it's really rockin', but apparently this album underperformed, and it's one of the various things that led to the band breaking up. But goddamn, that first song, the title track, Long John Silver, is one of the catchiest songs Jefferson Airplane ever did. Jack Cassidy actually wrote it. It's got that driving, cool bass line. Grace sings this. In fact, Grace sings most of the songs. This is the album that has the most lead vocals from Grace Slick. Just really hard rocking, very driving. Grace's vocals are so strong, so commanding. One of the great rock singers. And then you have Airy, in parentheses, Gang of Eagles. I'll forgive them for that. But wow, what an amazing song. Majestic vocals. Some of Grace's, again, some of her best vocals that she ever did. She wrote this song, powerful song. And then we got my favorite song on the album, written by Paul Kantner, Twilight Double Leader. Twilight Double Leader is just a straight up hard rockin' funky jam. It's both funky and hard rockin'. Something that only Led Zeppelin and 70s Aerosmith were ever to really pull off. Well, Jefferson Airplane pulled it off here. God damn. And listen to the live version that's on the corresponding live album, which I'll be discussing. God damn. This is some hard rockin' funky shit. If you want to hear an awesome deep track from Jefferson Airplane that will rock your world, listen to Twilight Double Leader. Milk Train, great song. The Son of Jesus, Paul Kantner, very controversial song, very interesting. Like that. Easter with a question mark, a continuation of the last one, perhaps. Trial by Fire, great Kekkonen song. And, to me, Kekkonen at this point is pretty much filling in for Marty Balin, whereas he's that offset. That other guy who's maybe not quite as out there as Grace and Paul Kantner are. He grounds it a bit. And I feel like he's now fully stepped into that role. So it's nice when he comes in and adds like a song like that. And Alexander the Medium and Eat Starch Mom. Every song on this album is great. It is solid. It is a solid hard rock album. And I would say that if you are a fan of heavy metal or hard rock, definitely check out Long John Silver. I think it will surprise you how hard rocking it is and how consistent it is. And it's definitely an undervalued album that more people should be talking about. This is the path I would have liked Jefferson Airplane to have gone into. If this was successful, it probably would have been. Unfortunately, because this album didn't do so well and they weren't as much of a draw as they were before, they would go into another direction and actually start leaning more into the pop side. But before I talk about that and wrap things up, I want to talk about two things. I want to discuss the two live albums and a couple important side projects. The first live album that Jefferson Airplane released came actually from the Crown of Creation tour, Bless Your Pointed Little Head. Amazing live album, one of the great live albums from the late 60s. Live, they are a different animal than they are in the studio. A lot of improvisation, a lot of fun. They're very entertaining. Grace talks to the crowd in between tracks. Unless you get the version of bonus tracks, there's nothing from Baxter's or Crown of Creation. It's only a couple songs from the first album, some covers, and a really long, cool experimental track with improvisational lyrics from Grace Slick, Bear Melt. Yes, Bear Melt. Epic track, really cool. And this live album is the only place you can hear it. They never did a studio version. Also, get the version with the bonus tracks. They do Saturday Afternoon, which is, to me, the definitive Jefferson Airplane live song. So you want to hear that. And there's a great version of that on that. Plus, there's also a great version of Today, which I like even better live. Brings out some of the darkness to it. And that's great. But even without those bonus tracks, this is an amazing live album and a great document. And I like, for the most part, that it's stuff that's only on this album. It makes it a unique listening experience and not your typical live album. And it shows up in the studio and both as a live act. Jefferson Airplane were a force to reckon with. Their second live album, I think, is even better. 30 Seconds Over Winterland. Although Half of it was actually not recorded in the Winterland Arena in San Francisco. Half of it was actually recorded in Chicago, but we'll let them slide. It's amazing. This is from the Long John Silver tour, and this would be their last tour, sadly, the last Jefferson Airplane tour. For the most part, they focus on tracks from Bark and Long John Silver and a couple classics, but mainly they're focusing on their two most recent albums at the time. And it's great because those songs are very live friendly and very hard rock, and especially the Long John Silver stuff. It sounds great, and the sound quality is great, and I would say this is one of the strongest live albums from the early 70s. I think it's a great album. It's a sin that the masses did not get behind this more hard rockin' version of Jefferson Airplane. To me, they were competing. They were right there with Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and Black Sabbath. This version of Jefferson Airplane definitely should have took off. But unfortunately, people are lame. They didn't want that from Jefferson Airplane, and Jefferson Airplane would move in a popular direction when they reconfigured themselves as Jefferson Starship. But before we wrap up, I do want to mention 3 side projects, Paul Kantner side projects, that I think if you're a fan, especially if you're a fan of like the more experimental stuff in an album like Bark, you should definitely check out these albums. The first album I want to discuss is Blows Against the Empire, which came out in 1970. This is credited as Paul Kantner and Jefferson Starship. It's the first time that the Jefferson Starship moniker was used, but this really has nothing to do, especially from a creative standpoint, this has nothing to do with what Jefferson Starship would be in the mid and late 70s. It's really, if anything, it feels more like an extension of what was going on with Jefferson Airplane. It's a rock opera, essentially, a concept album. Here's my hot take. I think it's better than Tommy. Yeah, I said it. I think it's better than Tommy. Essentially about a bunch of counterculture young people that want to rebel against their authoritarian government that, runs the world, and they want to escape on a spaceship. They want to escape on a starship. So they hijack the starship and they go and want to create a utopia on another planet. And that first track, Mau Mau, American, man, does that kick ass. That's a rockin' track, really gets you in there. My favorite track's a song, the third track called Let's Go Together. Has great harmonies between Paul Kantner and Grace Slick. Really rousing anthem, like those anthems that those two can write together. Hey, if this was a Jefferson Airplane song, it would sound like a perfectly great and well-realized anthemic Jefferson Airplane song. It's on that level. A Child Is Coming is really good. This is a great album. This is an album you can just get lost into. It's like a movie. It's like watching a movie, but you're listening to it instead of watching it. It features a lot of members of Jefferson Airplane, and it's Paul Kantner and Grace Slick, who by this point were now a couple. Now she was with Paul Kantner, and they officially became the king and queen of Jefferson Airplane land. And then they took it even one step further with the next album that I want to discuss, a 1971 album credited to Paul Kantner and Grace Slick. So it's Paul Kantner and Grace Slick. It's called Sunfighter. Not as strong as Blows Against the Empire, in my opinion, but Sunfighter is still a really good album. That's their daughter, China, on the cover. There you go. The Messiah son child. She ended up becoming like an actress and a VJ, so not quite the Messiah, but I'm sure they were still proud of her regardless. A lot of great piano work from Grace Slick throughout. This is, I would call it like a hippie spiritual album, very spiritual, very prog. I love Look at the Wood, and when I was a boy, I watched The Wolves. It's a really good album. I wouldn't put it on par with the Jefferson Airplane albums or Blows Against the Empire, but still, if you like all that stuff, definitely check this out. It's a very pure album and a very spiritual album, and I dig it. And finally, the last thing that Paul Kantner and Grace Slick that they did during this time period that I'm covering in 1973, shortly after the breakup of Jefferson Airplane, they did, Paul Kantner and Grace Slick did another album, which they also credited to the singer David Friedberg as the third wheel here, but essentially it's Paul Kantner and Grace Slick. More, I would say, like hippie, spiritual kind of prog gospel songs, a lot of piano and cool guitar work here and there. I really love, my favorite song is a song called Your Mind Has Left Your Body. That's a great trippy psychedelic kind of track, and it's good. Not quite as good as Starfighter, so we got some diminishing returns here, but still an interesting album. And if you're a fan of early 70s like space rock and prog rock, you should definitely check it out. It's the last rays of the setting sun pretty much on their creativity, because they would then, as Jefferson Starship, move in a more calculated and commercial direction, which, they would have a few good songs on the first two albums anyway. There would be a couple good songs. But for the most part, I'm not a huge fan of Jefferson Starship. I'm even less of a fan of Starship, that shitty pop band that Grace Slick had a couple hits with in the 80s. It's just not for me. I had the Jefferson Starship albums, but save for a few songs here and there, they're nowhere near the same level of Jefferson Airplane. It's definitely a totally different band with a different ethos, just a different level of quality. They were just kind of churning out shit just to make a buck. Very different, very different. Kind of sad in a way, and it kind of represents like kind of the fall of the 60s. I don't think any band kind of represents the fall of the 60s more than Jefferson Airplane, because no band epitomized the 60s more than Jefferson Airplane. I also think Jefferson Airplane were a uniquely and distinctly American band. I mean, I don't think they just had the flag up there as a form of counterculture, satire, and rebellion. I think at a core they were really trying to save America. They were trying to save America. They were trying to make America great. And what they saw is like trying to get to a more authentic and pure and honest America. And I think that's something that gets really lost when we look back at the 60s and look back at the counterculture of the 60s. They're evoking cowboys in the Old West with the fringe and a lot of the way they dressed, and the 19th century style of hair and mustaches. There was something reactionary to it and progressive at the same time, when the far right and the far left kind of meet each other. And that's something I feel like we're seeing nowadays in the world. Someone that wants to go off and live off the land, well, is that right wing? Is that left wing? What is that exactly? Like someone who wants to raise their own chickens and create their own utopia. And I think ultimately anyone that is looking around and wants to reject this plastic corporate world that is constantly being thrust at us and trying to dominate us and trying to stamp out any of our eccentric and messy and primal, complicated characteristics, they are going to be drawn to other things. They're going to be drawn to things from the past. Like we are drawn to things in the past because we're looking for a better future. Progress is not always moving in a straight line ahead. If you do that, you eventually go over a cliff. Sometimes it's about zigzagging and maybe 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 2 steps back and 1 step forward. And Jefferson Airplane was all about that. They were all about that musically, they were about that politically, they were about that spiritually, philosophically. Everything about them was about wrestling with America and their own identities. They were a truly existential band. Listening to a Jefferson Airplane album is like reading a late 60s Norman Mailer book or watching a Jean-Luc Godard film. It's art that's rolling up its sleeves and daring to tussle with the times. And that's a spirit that I think is worth preserving. That's a spirit that's worth fighting for. That's all stuff I get from Jefferson Airplane. You should definitely check them out. And this is it for the condo. I'm going to end on a personal note here. I've been making videos from this location, this condo in Tampa, Florida. During the pandemic, I started making videos here. Sometimes I would do them in LA and Sherman Oaks. Sometimes I would do them here. I had a brief period where I was at a buddy's house in West Hollywood. I did a few videos there. But the majority of my videos have been here in this condo in Tampa, Florida. I will be moving in the next couple months. I need a life change. I want to live in a different place, a different part of the country, and someplace I've never lived before. So I will be moving to the Nashville area. So I will be living there. I haven't found exactly the spot I'll be living yet, but I know it's going to be in the Nashville area, and I am putting up this condo for sale, putting up for sale next week. By the time this video gets published, it might already be sold. So this backdrop, this very cool backdrop, which I might not replicate, the backdrop might not look quite as cool as this backdrop, but I will still make sure it's somewhat cool. So don't worry, I will still have some kind of cool backdrop behind me, but say goodbye to this backdrop, say goodbye to the condo. This will be the last video in which you see it. After this video, because I'll be busy moving and looking for a new place and all that, I will probably not be putting out as many videos for a couple months there. But once I'm situated, once I got my new place, I'm going to start making new videos with a vengeance. So I hope all you subscribers hang in there, watch some of my old stuff in the meantime, and I promise I will be coming back with a lot of really cool content in the spring. This is Edwin Canestracci signing off from Tampa, Florida. It was part of my life, but It's not part of my future. I'm moving on. I'm Edwin Canistracci. Rock and roll.